Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about learning game design from old sitcoms. Now I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about this and then how it connects to video games kind of at the end. But the last few years have been interesting. I've probably watched more television in the last 3 years than I have in the last 30. And for a whole bunch of reasons. One, I was working part time. Two, I had moved to a new city where I didn't know anybody, in a new state where I didn't know anybody, and I did that all in the middle of a pandemic. I moved up here in the middle of 2020. So I just had a lot of free time on my hands and nowhere I could go. So I ended up watching a lot of TV shows. Now I'm going to walk you through what I did. At one point, I started consciously doing it. I started off just watching random TV shows, and then I'm like, I'm going to do something specific. I'm going to watch sitcoms that are representative of a decade. And I'm just going to do them in order, and then I'm going to talk about what I got from that. So for the 50s, I watched I Love Lucy. I don't think this needs any introduction. Everybody knows about I Love Lucy. It's Lucille Ball living with Desi Arnaz. He runs a club. She's always getting into wacky situations, usually with her neighbor, Ethel, who's her age and is inexplicably married to someone 20 years older, and this never comes up in the show. For the 60s, I watched The Dick Van Dyke Show, which, like I Love Lucy, was in black and white, and this is the last time I'd ever watch a black and white show in this sitcom series of things I'm watching. So The Dick Van Dyke Show was interesting, too, because it was very 60s. It was, guy wears a suit, leaves house every day, says goodbye to wife and child, and goes to work. What was interesting about it was he worked as a writer on a TV show, and one of the writers was a woman. And I don't even think that ever came up. They spent more time making fun of their boss being bald, which was very interesting and very kind of like, okay, I hope no one watching Chemotherapy is watching Dick Van Dyke Show, because there's a lot of bald jokes. For the 70s, it was a weird mix. I started watching the Mary Tyler Moore Show, and I did watch it all. And it was interesting seeing Mary Tyler Moore, who was in the Dick Van Dyke Show, suddenly playing a different character in a different era. I mean, she was a single woman, moved to the big city, and gets a job. They touched on a bunch of stuff, and I'll talk about that. But what was also interesting to me personally was MASH. I watched MASH again. I rewatched it. MASH, I think, ran from 71 to 83. I think that's when it ran. That's pretty much my entire childhood. That's me from like 5 or 6 up to about 18. So MASH was boom. When I can remember being a kid, MASH was on TV. And MASH was very liberal. It was very anti-war. And even though it came across as anti-military, it really was more anti-bureaucracy. You can see some MASH in The Outer Worlds. And then the other one I picked was Three's Company, which started in 1977. So it was kind of the late 70s. Three's Company is interesting because its whole premise is Jack has to pretend to be gay to share an apartment with 2 women. What's weird about that is that's the late 70s. A little more than 10 years later, I'm sharing an apartment with a couple, a man and a woman. They're not married, but we couldn't actually get the apartment, which was a 2-bedroom apartment. They had one, I had the other. We couldn't get that apartment unless they could show a marriage license to the landlord. And that was super strange. They never said, "Are you married?" Or if they did, it was, well, then now you have to show a marriage license. All I know is when we went in, they were like, "Wait, at a couple and are you 2 married?" And my friend just said, "Here's our marriage license." And that was it. That was the last time anybody ever said anything. And it wasn't a big deal to the 20-somethings. I was 22, 23. Nobody my age cared. And to think that Three's Company, which had been out 10 years before, that was the whole premise of the show. For the 80s, I picked 2. I picked Family Ties, which I watched in the 80s and rewatched. And I also picked Golden Girls, which my mom loved. And I recently rewatched and realized, oh my God, I'm the age of the Golden Girls. They're supposed to be in their mid to late 50s. And that's me. I'm a Golden Girl. Funny. Both shows were funny for different reasons. Family Ties was very making fun of capitalism, because Alex P. Keaton was a young capitalist, a young Republican. And the Golden Girls was, oh my God, ageism, being retired, being a single woman, all the stuff, all the tropes about that. But both of them hit a lot of social issues, and I'll talk about that. Then we get to the 90s. I don't have anything in the 90s. The 90s was my lost decade, and there's a video below you can watch about my lost decade, which was 93 to 2003. Well, guess what? That's pretty much almost any show I would have watched. I would have put Friends here, which I have subsequently watched, but I didn't watch it then, which is weird because those actors are exactly my age, and getting into wacky situations and just being goofs, and that was fun to watch. I had a roommate in mid to late 90s who watched the show, and that's primarily the episodes I saw because I'd come home and he'd have the TV on. I'm like, oh, it's Friends, and I'd sit down and watch. But I didn't see them all sequentially until years later. For the 2000s, I picked Will and Grace. I love that show. Yes, it started in late 98, early 99, but it's pretty much set in the 2000s. Again, the conceit of the show is, oh no, he's gay and she's straight and they're best friends. And now that just is like, it's not that big. Even during the run of the show, it lost its relevance. The first year, he's got a boss who's from Texas. And he even says, anything I don't get between you two, I just assume it's because you're gay, Will. After a year, they realized, yeah, that's not really that funny anymore. So it just became a show about funny people doing funny things. And then for the 2010s, it was Community. Gotta have Community in there. Super funny. Love the show. I didn't do anything for the 2020s because we're only a few years into it. So Community is where I stopped this set of sitcoms. Now, let's take a look at these, and especially that many of these are based on premises that aren't going to make sense to future generations. Some of them already are kind of nonsensical. For example, what is so funny about a woman wanting to work? That's pretty much a major premise of I Love Lucy, that she's tired of being a housewife. And by the way, it's weird to watch her be a housewife and put on a dress and jewelry and makeup and do her hair up, and all she's going to do is be at the house all day and clean and cook. It's strange. But even going into this, that was the 50s. Even going into the 70s, we have Mary Tyler Moore. And the funny premise there is, oh, she doesn't want to be married. She wants to be single and she wants a career. It's like, and even you can tell that that's such a thin premise that eventually it becomes a show about her funny, weird friends and funny and weird work colleagues. I mean, they mention it a few times, and then it kind of goes away. And then you have the whole man and woman sharing an apartment. It's like, I did that it was 1990. So by then it was already not strange. So Three's Company, when you watch it, the whole premise of him having to pretend to be gay and he's doing it to share an apartment just doesn't even make sense anymore. Now the show's funny because it has funny elements like physical comedy, like John Ritter does, will never get old. So it's still a funny show, but its main premise just makes you go, what? Will and Grace, like I said, its main premise, he's gay, she's straight, wacky. I mean, it kind of goes away quickly, and they even make it kind of a sad thing where he has to tell her, they're planning to get married, and he has to tell her she's gay. So, but it's interesting too because that episode even messes up by making coming out being an event, and then he never really has to do it again. We're really coming out as a process and it never stops and all that. So even then, that show's starting to feel a little old and dated. But what really I found ages all these shows, and I've mentioned this before, isn't the humor or the style of humor or even some jokes. It is all of the references to politics, to politicians, to current events. They age those shows even more dramatically than clothes and technology. Because what happens is they will mention an actor or a politician by name, or they're specifically reference an event. And the older the show, the more likely I was to go, I don't know who that is. And because of that, I don't get the joke, and I feel left out, it breaks my rule of comedy, which is if you tell a joke and it makes part of your audience feel excluded, that's a bad joke. So the early shows do that, and they're not trying to. They're playing to their audience. I don't even think I Love Lucy knew would ever be in reruns. There's a whole interesting thing about that, about how it was filmed, and they thought it was just going to be, filmed, aired, and then tossed. Now, interestingly, now that I've said all that, let me just say that there were some topics that have never gone away and don't always make a lot of progress, and they're kind of evergreen. For example, stories about women's struggles. For all its progressive stance, MASH's take on women was a little odd. It was a little misogynistic. Even though, like, Hawkeye would stand up for the nurses, he was always chasing nurses. He was always saying things that were very unconsciously male-oriented, like, I'm a doctor. He yelled at a nurse in a few episodes, which surprised me. I don't remember that, and they didn't do it a lot, but he did it. And also Klinger, they called him a transvestite, and they made fun of it, and it's funny, but I'm wondering, is this is going to age badly? I don't know. Time will tell. LGBT stuff, which is near and dear to me, I watched it progress oddly through these sitcoms. It was ignored in the 50s, 60s, was not mentioned. But then in the 70s, it was amazing. There were gay characters. Nobody cared they were gay. They were shown they weren't stereotypically gay. And then the 80s happened, and gays become very stereotypical, and being gay was thrust into the main thing. Like, if you're gay, that's everything about your character. And it took a few years for it to the 2000s to roll around for it to be less of an issue. So it was weird that it went forward and then slipped back and then kind of moved forward again. Now, what I loved about Community is I think Community is a master class in how to make fun of people, and by that I mean a group of people, without being hurtful and without necessarily falling into stereotypes. Shirley got to be very religious in that show, and they call her out on her hypocrisy, but she still gets to be religious, and she really is a good person. She and Troy get to be black. They don't ignore that they're black, but they do it in a funny way, and it makes it not an issue. It's just, yes, they're black. Yes, sometimes they say things that a black person would say in that situation, especially the D&D episode where Chang comes dressed in blackface. These are funny. I can't believe that episode is censored on some streaming services. That's stupid. The one thing it does is Pierce is old and is annoying, and I would go, oh, they're being ageist. But then they have Leonard, who's old and weird and a little annoying too, but all the characters are annoying, actually. He's kind of cool, though, in his way. He doesn't care what people think, and they're always calling him out on doing his weird stuff. They also showed in one episode how a different actor, in this case Fred Willard, could have replaced Chevy Chase, and then it would have totally changed your take on Pierce. I love that episode because of that. So, here's what I think you can learn about game development, because I've now talked for over 13 minutes about sitcoms. Here's what I think you can learn about game development. I think there's two really good lessons that you can pull out of this. One, try to avoid very distinctive references to people and events. It will age your game quickly. A lot of people are going, hey, that's not a big deal because games come and go. If you look on Good Old Games, I got a 25-year-old game up there. It's 27 years old now. And it's up there, and people are playing it. And I'm glad it doesn't reference a lot of things in such a direct way that it makes people feel excluded. So try to do that. But the second thing is, you need to try to think of what the future is going to think of a topic, or even if they care about a topic. So, like I said, some things like, oh no, a man and a woman are sharing an apartment, or a woman wants a career, those just aren't funny anymore. They're not even a thing. And in fact, it probably would confuse younger people and go, why is that premise funny? I don't get the humor. But some things are universal. How men and women interact. I would say the battle of the sexes, and now there's more than two sexes. So this stuff is universal. Race relationships. Physical humor, people just saying silly things, people having misunderstandings. Those things are always going to be universally funny. But other topics, those aren't as funny as you think anymore. And the big thing for you as a game designer is, can you tell the difference between those two? Are you going to be able to understand why putting something in your game is going to make your game dated and far less funny than you think in just the space of a few short years? So that's the big thing I got out of watching all these sitcoms. And if you watch them too, I think you'll have the same response. There are some things in old sitcoms that not only aren't funny, you don't even understand why they're trying to be funny. And then as you come up to the modern era, you see things that are funny, but some of them you can look at and go, I bet you in 20 years people aren't going to see the humor in that. So try to do the same thing in your game. If you want to try humor or reference, be careful.